Okay.
But you can tell where somebody got their social security card from the number.
So I think we're going.
Okay.
So, even though we know this, welcome to your interrogation, Uncle George.
Not guilty.
Do you recommend you answer
Well,
the
we'll
questions
figure that out. By the
honestly?
time we're done, we'll know that, guilty or not. What is your full name?
George Alfred Masters.
And
Actually, I was born June 1st in 1936 in a hospital in Hackensack, New Jersey, but the family lived in Woodcliff Lake, New Jersey. And I don't know what the population was, probably 9, counting dogs and cats. I mean, it was a small town. One store, gas station, post office, and all in the same building. So that's how big the town was when we lived there.
and where did you live in Woodcliff? Is this where you had the cabin?
This, we lived on top of the hill. It was a house that was owned by one of Dad's aunts. We called her Tanta, I don't know, her priest, D.E. priest. And I thought it was big at the time, when you're young. But it was, it was nice. It had a big, huge property. My folks had a big garden out back. My dad even had a tractor at one point in time. And I can remember nice things from the garden, like peas. My brother and I would eat on the porch. And we eat one pea and drop one over the porch. Eat one pea and drop one over the porch. But it was good. We lived there actually until Pearl Harbor. And when Pearl Harbor hit, then my dad, who was in the military reserves, had to start wearing a uniform. And he rode a train into New York, and he was stationed at Governor's Island. And until that time, neighbors didn't realize he was military, because he never had to wear a uniform unless he was going to be with troops marching or something. So that was interesting. The Pearl Harbor kind of changed a lot of things. For one, we moved from the top of the hill down to the bottom of the hill, had a different house, and that was where my sister was actually born, or we lived there when she was born. Bob and I got into a lot of mischief, and probably not every single time, but most of the times when I got in trouble, yeah. You can't, I know you're not supposed to speak about the dead, but he got me in trouble. So. Anyway, that was all well and good. And he was the only one that gave me a nickname called Crumb Bum.
Oh yeah.
And he was the only one that used that. I mean, other people used like Georgie Porgy, Georgie Porgy pudding and pie, kissed the girls and made them cry, and I would respond, for more. I learned early. And what other homes and places have I lived? Wow. My dad was military, as I said. He was also a troubleshooter. He was an engineer, and he was an ordnance. And so he had a lot of details to other places. And if it was 90 days or more, we would move to that location and rent something. And so I think, I don't know how many times we moved, but according to last count, I was in 17 different schools. Now, you asked me to name them, I can name 4 high schools, but I can't name all the elementary schools. I mean, a lot of them just had town names and stuff like that. And moving around, some people consider that very difficult, but I considered it an education, because one, you learn to get along with people, to induce yourself to a new society or a new way things are, and we weren't raised with prejudices and stuff like that at the time, and so my mother and father were members of the charter members of the first Chinese Christian church in New York City. Matter of fact, that's where they were married. So when we lived in New York, we went to church there. And I learned the Lord's Prayer in Chinese. I couldn't give it to you now, but we learned a little bit of Chinese, which kind of probably was a help to my dad, because when he was sent overseas during World War II, he was went to China.
So why did they attend the first Chinese Christian church in New York before he went to China?
Well, that's where they got married. And they met. He was in a quartet. He played the violin, and the cellist was sick or something. So my mother was asked to join the quartet, and that's where they met. And so she would play the cello, and he would play the violin. And at that time, he worked with the Chinese youth, the teenagers and stuff, in that church. And so we had a lot of, quote, Chinese boys, we call them. You know, they were adults, or some of them, but, and they all joined his reserve army outfit. So we had a lot of functions together. Even when we lived in Woodcliff Lake, when Bob and I were very small, they would come to our house and they'd play volleyball, and we'd have big lunches on the lawn. I mean, it was great. Those people, I mean, I want to tell you, those people were so great. At my folks' anniversary, which was New Year's Eve, they got cards from people all over the world. You know, I mean, even later, I mean, this went on for years and years and years. And I remember one of them was a guy named, oh man, what was his name? He was a partner in the restaurant in San Francisco.
Is that Tom Plun?
Yeah, Tom Plun. He was a partner in the restaurant in San Francisco. What was the name of it? I have a perfect memory, but it's very short, and so I ramble a lot. But they always, you know, I mean, they'd send stuff, and even after I was no longer living with my folks, Tom Plun would send us, or his wife would send us oyster sauce, which I loved on rice. I mean, it was just great.
So when you were talking about these outings that you had in the lawn and you'd play volleyball and all that, is that the place where we had the movies that you gave to Paul on the discs? Is that where that was?
Yeah.
Okay.
And you know what? He never returned the disc.
Oh,
Have to
yes,
edit
he
that out later.
Yeah, actually, you know, he did. He returned them to me
Uh-huh.
to give them to you,
Okay.
and they
You
are
forgot.
safely ensconced in my desk.
Well,
So
that's good.
I will
I
see
know
that you
they're
get
safe.
them.
Well,
Let's just move on.
At least you fessed up, Mark.
Well, I couldn't let Paul take the fall
Sure
for it
you
because I just now remembered. Yes, I do have those discs.
Well, you know, that's not something I look at every day. As a matter of fact, the only time I really recently looked at it was when this whole thing developed. I went, oh, wow, you know. And it reminded me of things, among other things, that particular disc was in Woodcliff Lake at the top of the hill, showed my brother and I playing in a tub, inappropriately dressed. And it also showed us swinging on the trapeze we had on the porch, and picnics with the Chinese guys and them playing volleyball.
So what's inappropriate in a bathtub? I'm just curious.
Nudity.
I thought you said you had clothes. Well, you said you had clothes that were
Dressed in
inappropriate, so I guess
skivvies.
no clothes.
That's always thought you're supposed to dress for a bath. Well, we should have covered this earlier in my life.
Clothes. That's what you do when you buy a house, clothes, right?
That's right.
Okay. Yeah.
Moving on.
And but those were good times. I mean, we had on Wicklow Lake. We had chickens, and we had this one rooster that would chase me, and and we had trees, and my brother and I would climb trees. And, it was, you know, it was carefree. At that point in time, if you saw an airplane, you pointed up, and everybody looked up to see the airplane. And it never was Superman, but we always.
Did you tell if it was Wilbur or Orville?
Yeah, could have been. And,
Was that your favorite place that you lived as you were growing up?
I don't know. I mean, I liked every place I lived, but some I wouldn't go back to. I mean, like, I liked it, even when we lived in New York, 192nd Street and Wadsworth Avenue. I remember that. New York, 33 New York. How about them apples?
Yeah, how
I
about
don't know
that?
the phone number, but,
That's good.
and I went to PS 189, which was a unique experience. And matter of fact, something
Public
that.
school, when they
Public
do
school.
that.
Yeah, that's what they, all the elementary schools were named PS.
Yes.
And the high schools actually had names. But the thing about that was, this is New York City, all right? Every Tuesday we had an assembly in the auditorium, and boys would wear white shirts and ties, and red ties actually. And we would open this assembly with the Pledge of Allegiance. And one of the things we always sang in the assembly was "Holy, Holy, Holy."
Wow.
And, I mean, you look at today, I mean, the country has made some changes, and I'm not sure I agree with most of them, but it was nice. I mean, you know, New York gets a bad rap from time to time. You know, we had baseball games, we stickball in the street, and we'd also play football in the street, and somebody'd be stationed on the roof to spot the cop cars. Because if the cops caught you with the football, the first time they made an X with a razor. And if they caught that same football again, they made the X really deep.
Wow.
I mean, the cops weren't our enemies, you know, really. I mean, they had a job to do and they were looking out for, you know, our safety. But we would roller skate in the street, play stickball, which is baseball, and with a tennis ball and a broomstick for a bat. And that was a great place.
Is that where the White Lives Matter movement started?
Yeah, right. And yeah, I enjoy that. I mean, I wouldn't drive through that same neighborhood today. It's changed a lot. I think it's Spanish Harlem. And but prior to moving to New York, and New York was one place we bounced back and forth from, because Dad was always, for a long time, in First Army, which was the East Coast. And we would sublet the apartment and go to, like, Hamlet, North Carolina, or Indianapolis, Indiana, or all kinds of different places. So my mother had kept track of them all, and I lost the list. But every place we went was a new experience. We met new people, and you know, we learned new things, and we went on great vacations, driving then, and my dad would take us camping, and so, you know, that's cheap. We'd drive. The highways then were a little different from now. I mean, you'd stop alongside the highway, and girls on the right and boys on the left kind of thing, you know, and we could camp any place virtually where there wasn't a house. It was a different life back then, and not a bad life. Yeah, we missed some things that maybe we could add today, like cell phones, which I hate, and, you know, Facebook and all that sort of stuff, which people abuse, and people won't look up and talk to each other. They'll tick, 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 text each other. But anyway, back to the ranch. As I said, my sister was born at the house at the bottom of the hill in Woodcliff Lake. And she was born in 1942, right at the start of World War II. And she was a good bit younger than us, I think 6.5 years younger than me, and which colors her memories too. So then, you know, when we moved to New York, I remember then pushing a baby carriage with my sister in it. And we moved to other places, and then we get back to New York. And then when my dad went overseas, Ginger was very small. And of course, we got letters and stuff from Dad. The Chinese generals come back to the U.S., and they visit us and take us out to dinner in Chinatown. And Peking duck, and all kinds of great stuff that I really liked. And they tell us stories about my dad. Of course, my dad would never say anything. I mean, everything was rosy, you know. The only thing he did like was cans of lemon drops. One, lemon drops wouldn't break, and he'd get them eventually. And that's one thing about the military, no matter where you are, they find you with your mail. And that's always amazed me that they were able to do that. But he was over there, he was in China, CBI, China, Burma, India campaign, and drove up and down the Burma Road. And he did tell some stories about that, about how sharp the curves were, and how the Army trucks had trouble getting around some of the curves. And they had not just the Japanese as enemies, but a lot of Chinese guerrillas or robbers or thieves or whatever. But he made good friends with the Chinese, and as I say, the generals came and visited us and treated us greatly. And when he came back, it was very interesting. I got a call to go to the principal's office, and I went down there, and he says, "You have to go home right away. Something happened." So I was worried at that time, but I ran all the way home, and there was Dad.
Wow.
We didn't know he was coming back. We had gotten his Foot Locker, but usually that's a bad sign. But when he did come back, Nen was pushing the baby carriage or the stroller with my sister down the street. And Dad was walking because we didn't know he was coming. And when I got home, I remember Bob was at that time and his grandfather, Nen's father, because Nen had some trouble controlling him from time to time. Very unusual. And we were sitting on the sofa, and Ginger said, "Which daddy is this?" So you can imagine the silence. My mother said, "What do you mean?" And so she went and she got pictures, several pictures of my dad. And one was in civilian clothes, one was in military, and she thought they were all different people. So I'm sure she doesn't remember that because she was kind of small at the time. And it was about 1943, I think 43. But anyway, when he came back, then he was transferred to Fort Dix, New Jersey. And that was an interesting experience because we got to live in a community which was a vacation community for people with cabins. And so we had a cabin which had a bedroom and a kind of sitting room and a kind of kitchen with a pump for water. And my brother and I slept outside in sleeping bags. And of course, the facility was 50 feet down this path. But along came winter, another cabin opened up. And so my brother and I moved into it, our sleeping bags there. And that was another instance of my brother's sometimes not good behavior. We were fascinated with the military, and I'd make tents out of paper. And he says, "Well, let's pretend they're being bombed," and he lit them on fire.
Oh dear.
And we did manage to get it out, but I mean, wow, come on, guys. And one time we got a fire engine, and so he set some weeds on fire so we could see if we could put it out. My mother had to come out with a broom and help us put it out. I mean, not good, not good. And as I say, when I got in trouble, usually he was involved. It's not to say I couldn't get in trouble by myself. I knew how.
Was this before you went to Germany?
Yeah, this was before we went to Germany.
So how old were you?
Fort Dix was before we went to Germany. And I was about in the 5th grade then, which was interesting. In New York City, I learned cursive in the 2nd grade. We moved to Ewansville, New Jersey, and the school was in Vincenttown. We had a school bus ride for a distance. And they were still printing. And then they started cursive. And they thought I had the neatest handwriting in the world until they learned how. But, I mean, and different places we went to different schools, my mother would have to tutor us to make sure we stayed up and didn't get put back. Because I'd already been promoted ahead. I jumped a grade. And believe it or not, that was in kindergarten is what I jumped. Because I had a good friend in the first grade, and I did everything he did. And it was a new teacher. She didn't realize I was not in the first grade. And so she promoted me to the second grade. And when we went down and found out, what's going on here? She said, well, he did all the work. I mean, you know, well, so that was it. I was already a year ahead of myself, which was not necessarily good because I was small for my age in addition to that. So just sometimes led to problems when I was introduced in a new school. But
What was your favorite subject in school, Uncle George?
I think I did really well in math, but I generally liked everything except I didn't like history. And the problem with history is you had to memorize dates. And for some reason, I did not do well with that. So that was but you know, as a child, every place we went, I mean, we were kids. You know, we played baseball and sand lots and stuff like that. And, Ring-a-Levio, hide and go seek, all these kid games. And I had a great childhood, and I never had trouble making acquaintances. You don't make friends when you move that often, because otherwise parting can be difficult. So you make acquaintances every place you go. And some of the acquaintances you'll remember years later, and others you won't. I mean, but you don't have the sorrow of losing a friend.
What was Ring-a-Levio?
I was just going to ask that. What's Ring-a-Levio? It sounds like Doorbell Ditch.
Yeah, well, it's kind of, well, that was primarily New York. And we played that at night. And it was kind of like a version of Kick the Can, you know that. And Ring-a-Levio was something that gave you freedom. When you touched the base, Ring-a-Levio, and people would come running in. I don't remember all the details. The only place I played that was in New York City. But I had a great childhood. I mean, play. You know? Except when my mother was tutoring us, and it was great. But back to New Jersey and Fort Dix. Fort Dix was a good experience. My dad showed us the first military jet, and it was a plane without an engine. I mean, a propeller, and we got to do things. We got to ride in a weasel and a duck, and duck is a amphibious truck, and weasel's an amphibious, kind of like a Jeep, I guess, and things like that. We got to ride in things. And my dad was good at ordnance. He had a lot of contacts. Of course, he also had a lot of assignments. But
Now, you said that some acquaintances you met you remembered and some you don't. What are some of your, who are some ones you remembered?
for one reason, I remember a guy named Charlie Bowman, and that was in New York City, and he was the captain of a baseball team. We played sandlot baseball. It wasn't sandlot, it was asphalt parking lot. When I was in high school, a guy named Dale, and he actually I boarded with he and his mother and a senior in high school, but that's later down. But I've always had a bad memory for names, Chuck. So, actually, I blame my current bad memory on my career when I was working undercover. Because, and I'll get to that later, because you don't care about names, you just care about memorizing the face, because names have changed.
So before we get to your career, do you remember when you were growing up, do you remember what you wanted to be when you were a boy?
At first I wanted to be a doctor. And actually, as a child, I had asthma, and the first shot I got almost killed me. So for 48 hours, my folks weren't sure what I would be or how I would become, because it was the very, very beginning of allergy treatments. And they had diluted it as much as they thought they could, and it didn't dilute, so I went into anaphylactic shock, I guess it was. But, and after that, every time I got a shot, I mean, I screamed, bloody murder. I mean, they had to virtually hold me down. And then, good old buddy brother and I were in the park, and this was actually in New York City, and we were throwing rocks. And we were never supposed to do that. But I was throwing a rock, and he threw a rock at the same time. And it was a freak thing. It hit my finger and the rock. And the end of my finger was kind of hanging down. So we walked back home. And I don't know if I was screaming or not. My mother took us to a local doctor who kind of taped it all together and bandaged it up. And then she took us to Governor's Island, where the military hospital was. And the doctor on duty was the same doctor that gave me shots. And he wired it, sewed it on. And he says, "George, doesn't this hurt?" And I says, "Yes, sir." He says, "Well, how come you're not crying? Doesn't this hurt more than the shots?" "Yes, sir." Never cried again. But, that was really, I mean, that was interesting. I got good medical care, thanks to my dad's service. I mean, the military has good doctors, I tell you. And, but, you know, I mean, for years I didn't have any feeling in the end of my finger. And I bet guys that they could stick a pin through it and it wouldn't hurt. All of a sudden one day it hurt. The nerves grew back. But we learn as we go. And, let's see, Fort Dix. From Fort Dix, actually the next major assignment my dad was with the occupation forces in Germany. And so he was sent to Germany we moved into Brooklyn, New York, and we stayed there until we got to go, which was about 6 months later. And we went over by ship, and it was interesting. The kids were all in the troop quarters. We had books and a big barrel in the middle of the room. And the women and mothers and babies and all had staterooms, you know, that they shared. So, but it was good. And when we got to Bremerhaven, we were the first ones off the ship. Most of the people were going to southern Germany. And we were stationed in the Enclave, which was the northern part of Germany. And Dad came and picked us up. We somehow got across the river. I don't know, crossing that river in the wintertime was a real problem because there were no bridges in Bremerhaven. Some bad Air Force guys took them out.
You're pointing at me.
It's a little before your time.
Yeah.
And
Just missed that one.
my dad was a ranking military officer in that area where we lived in Einswarden. And so we got to take over a millionaire's house. And we had like 5 bedrooms on the second floor. The third floor was a 2-bedroom apartment for our housemeister and his wife. We had servants and stuff all furnished by the German government. And some of the servants we got rid of. I mean, the cook, she was walking out after smearing butter on her arms to get better. Things were not good after the war. I mean, you know, paper was very valuable, food, I mean, we couldn't buy anything on the open market. And once a month, the GIs would drive a truck all the way down to Bremen, cross the river, and come back to Bremerhaven to the commissary and do shopping for us in addition to the troops. And we'd get things like 8 cases of Coke. We couldn't drink the water. So we thought that was great at first, but not later. And we had a 14-foot or 12-foot refrigerator in the kitchen where we'd store everything. And But that house was fantastic. I mean, you know, your library.